This is Ross Coulthard, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am delighted to be joined by the co-founder of the Stargate Programme at Stanford Research Institute with Hal Puthoff, author of multiple books on the subjects of ESP and remote viewing. He is a pioneering laser physicist. I'd love to welcome the legendary Russell Targ. Russell, welcome to the podcast.
Very happy to be with you this morning.
Very good to have you on too, Russell. When I put out a few days ago to say you were coming on, huge response from people on YouTube, on Patreon, and all over the internet. So it's wonderful to finally have you on. But I'd love to start right back at the beginning. And for those who may be unfamiliar with who Russell Targ is, can you give us a little bit of an introduction as to you and your background?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, 1934. That shows that I survived 90 years of life in America. I was always interested in magic and sleight of hand. My father had a bookstore before he became a famous publisher, and the bookstore sold so-called tricks and jokes, sort of magic tricks that an 8-year-old could master. And I became very interested in magic and sleight of hand. My vision is very poor, as you probably catch on to watching me here. So if I could use a little psychic ability to advance over what my vision would provide, that was always good. So I was a very successful card player, and I eventually figured out that I was probably supplementing my bridge playing skills with whatever ESP came my way. So I had been doing magic on the stage in New York for birthday parties and art openings. And from time to time, I would pretend to be reading someone's mind as part of a trick called billet reading, where I got some information about a person and then pretend to be reading their mind. And in doing that kind of pretend mind reading, I would often get slips of information where I could actually see what the person's house was. And as I approached the end of high school, I realized that people were making their living studying psychic abilities with the American Society for Psychical Research, and I became friends with them. And by the time I was 16, I gave up stage magic, or gave up pretend magic, for studying psychic abilities. I became very experienced with what was actually being done in the laboratories. And I had the idea that I would like to do research in psychic abilities, research in ESP. And I often went to their meetings in New York City, City College of New York, and a very amiable, intelligent group of professors doing research in ESP. And what they had in common is they were all poor. Now, I grew up in the Depression era of Chicago, and one of the things that I learned is that I didn't want to replicate being poor. So I decided that I would not create my life as an ESP researcher, but rather I would follow my other passion, which was psychic, which was modern physics. So I got my degree from Queens College in New York in physics, and then got a graduate fellowship to Columbia University, where I could study ionization in gases. And that led me to an opportunity to take part in the very first laser research in the world. I worked with Gordon Gould, who is the inventor of the laser. And that was because I happened to have useful experience from Columbia. So I worked with Gordon for a number of years. We worked on the earliest laser. We didn't build the first laser, but we published among the first papers dealing with lasers. And then I moved to California and set up a laser lab at General Telephone. And by 1970, I had built the most powerful CO2 carbon dioxide laser in the world with a 1,000-watt laser. Could burn a hole right through a fire brick. And I realized at that time I had the chips available to trade in my laser chips for the idea of starting up a ESP laboratory, which is what I wanted to do. And I had built things for NASA, and I got an invitation to go to NASA and talk about American and Soviet research and psychic abilities. I'll spare you how I happened to get that invitation. The whole sequence of surprising events where I was lecturing at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and the director of new projects at NASA came and liked my lecture and invited me to a conference on speculative technology at St. Simon's Island and for NASA. And I went to that conference, and I was interested in starting a program, and I knew that NASA could help support me. And what I'm fishing for is a game that I have on the internet. This is a 4-choice ESP game which offers feedback and reinforcement. You want to guess one of those 4 pictures. And I lectured about that, among other things, at NASA. And Werner von Braun was in my audience, and he did very, very well this 4-choice game, offering feedback and reinforcement. And he confessed to me that he had been always very psychic with his grandmother and was very interested in ESP, although he had never done any research in that. So in this lecture here, I am sort of outing Werner von Braun as a closet psychic, which I think nobody else knows. But von Braun took me to the director of NASA, Jim Fletcher, and said, Russ has built some lasers for us that work very well. He's now interested in using a ESP teaching machine, which he has here, to help astronauts become aware of any possible flaws in the spacecraft. They had just dealt with a defect in Apollo 13, which almost crashed due to a defect in the oxygen tank, where it was an onboard accident. And I said, if astronaut could become aware or sympathetic with a spacecraft, you could avoid losing a spacecraft. And somehow von Braun and Jim Fletcher thought that all made sense. The idea that in the Foundation series of Isaac Asimov, the great semanticist said, just remember, nothing has to be true. A thing just has to sound true. So somehow my story for Werner von Braun and Jim Fletcher, that I could teach astronauts how to become psychic with their spacecraft, that somehow all made sense to them. And they agreed to give me a contract to set up a laboratory. And as we were talking, the astronaut Edgar Mitchell came strolling by. It just happened. And he said, well, I'm working for SRI now. I could help Russell set up a lab at SRI because I work for Charlie Anderson, who's the president of SRI. So because I was at the NASA conference with my ESP game, I was able to get money from NASA to set up a ESP laboratory in 1972, set this up at SRI. And I'm telling you this long story because people in the field, people in the ESP research, recognized that my colleague Hal Puthoff and I are both laser pioneers, well known for our laser work, but had no antecedents for ESP research. So people consider it quite magical. How did we show up with a $100,000 program at SRI to teach people how to be psychic, where what made us think that we knew how to do that?
You met Hal Puthoff at a lecture, I believe. Is that right?
That's right. He was lecturing in San Francisco on American Soviet ESP research, and I was lecturing on the same thing. We had both read the Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, and I knew the women Ostrander and Schroeder who wrote that book. I met them. My father was a New York publisher, and I met Ostrander and Schroeder at his birthday party. So I had the inside story of Psychic Discoveries. So I was lecturing on their book and what they had told me. And Hal had lectured. He spoke Russian, among other things. So, and we were both laser guys in Silicon Valley. We were neighbors. We didn't know each other. I was known at that time for my very powerful CO2 laser, which could cut a hole on a fire brick. So he knew who I was. And I asked him at his lecture that I told him I'm dealing with NASA now. I've built stuff for them in the past. If I could get money from NASA, could I join you at SRI and create an ESP laboratory? And he said that would be terrific. So when I met Edgar Mitchell at St. Simon's Island, Edgar Mitchell agreed to take money from Art Reitz, who listened to my lecture in San Francisco, and all the pieces fell together. We had a big meeting with the president of SRI, Charlie Anderson, and within a month we had a program at SRI.
So,
and Ingo Swann was already there working with Hal. And Ingo Swann said, you guys, I'm not going to guess cards for you guys. I want to do something that's worthy of my talent. Otherwise, I'm going home. This card guessing stuff is a trivialization of my ability, said Ingo. So he said, well, what do you want to do? He said, you go hide somewhere, have someone hide in the San Francisco Bay Area, anywhere, and I will tell you what it looks like where they are. That sounded like a good double-blind experiment. I would stay home at SRI and interview Ingo, and Hal and a lab director would hide somewhere, and Ingo would describe what that looked like. And Ingo was able to do that very successfully. Hal could go to the bank or a swimming pool or wherever he wanted to go, and Ingo would sit with me in a shielded room, close his eyes, and make a drawing of what it looked like where Hal was hiding. And Ingo said we should call that remote viewing. It's not necessarily mental telepathy, because you're not reading my mind. You're able to see where I am and see what I'm doing. So Ingo Swann, it's a little money from NASA, and the coincidental appearance of Ingo Swann allowed us to start an ESP program where our goal was to find people in the laboratory or in the neighborhood who are interested in learning how to develop their psychic abilities. And we did that for a decade.
You did, and I'm going to discuss that decade with you. You've had an incredible upbringing, even till you hit the 1970 era, before you get to SRI. And I wonder, let's take it back to basics. In your own words, what exactly is remote viewing?
Remote viewing is an ability that we all have, to quiet our minds and describe and experience what's happening in a distant place or in the future. The thing that we know is it is no harder to describe something 1,000 miles away than it is to describe something across the street. Similarly, from our experiments, we know that it's no harder to describe something that's going to happen in the future than it is to describe something that's happening contemporaneously. So we demonstrated that. You can see into the distance. Our favorite customer was the CIA, who supported our work. And one of the tasks that they gave us, we worked with the great psychic Ingo Swann and Pat Price. Price was able to quiet his mind and describe a Soviet atomic bomb factory in Soviet Siberia, in Semipalatinsk. And he could describe, we were given the geographical coordinates of Semipalatinsk, just given a piece of paper, and the CIA said, "Can you tell us what's going on there?" And Pat Price and I went to a shielded room where we like to work, and I said, "Here's a slip of paper. We have no idea what's there, but our friends at the CIA would like you to try and describe what's going on at the place corresponding to these coordinates." And Pat said, "I'm visualizing that I'm lying on top of a building. The sun feels good to me. And there's a huge crane rolling back and forth over my body. Great big gantry crane. And it's a 8-wheel crane, 4 wheels on either side of the track. And this big crane is rolling back and forth." And I said, "Can you draw that?" And he said, "Sure I can." And he made a very nice drawing, which you cannot quite see on the wall behind me, but I've published numerous things that I've published. I have a recent book called Third Eye Spies, which contain all the pictures that I'm going to be talking about. It's not convenient for me to show pictures right now. But Ingo drew a picture of this 4-wheel gantry crane, which greatly resembled the crane at Semipalatinsk. And the next day they said, "Well, that was really terrific. Can you tell us what they're doing in this building? Well, why do they have this big crane running around?" And Pat said, "Well, they're assembling a giant sphere, steel sphere, 60 feet in diameter, and they're welding it together." And he made us a drawing of this big sphere. And 2 years later, the Soviets dismantled this facility. People in the West got to see the 60-foot diameter sphere for the first time that was welded together. An important idea, I should tell you at the outset, in many cases, it's clear that the remote viewer is not necessarily describing where the person is hiding, but rather describing the feedback he gets at the end of the experiment. So, for example, our most successful, the easiest to do experiment is the psychic hide and go seek. Somebody's hiding in the Bay Area, and a visitor in the laboratory has the job of describing where the person is hiding, and then we will take that person, the visitor, to the hiding place for feedback. And it's a perfectly good double-blind experiment. I'm the interviewer, and I have no idea where they're hiding. Could be anywhere in the Bay Area. I've just instructed the skeptic or the person who's visiting me or the government officer is visiting me, my instructions are quiet your mind if you know how to do that. Take a couple of deep breaths and tell me about the surprising images that show up in your awareness. That's my instruction, to just tell me about the new surprising images that show up in your awareness. And with that clue, they can often very accurately describe where the other person is hiding. And then at the end of that experiment, we will take the viewer to that hiding place. And indeed, it turns out that the place that he drew and described is where the person is hiding. Now, it's possible that he is describing what he sees at a later time when we took him there, or he might be describing where they were actually hiding. Now, we have experiments where the person did not get any feedback because they died. So there are cases with Ingo Swann, who is a great psychic, and Pat Price, who is also an outstanding psychic. There are experiments with both of those people where they did outstanding remote viewing for us, but unfortunately they passed away before they got any feedback. So we know for a fact that although sometimes people will describe the feedback they receive, that is not necessary. If they can't get feedback for some reason, like passing away, they can describe the target anywhere.
Now, that's really interesting. You mentioned Pat Price and Ingo Swann, the two most famous remote viewers. How did they discover their abilities? You mentioned these are latent or suppressed abilities. Everyone can do this. How did those individuals discover that they could do this?
I believe, but I know that Ingo Swann was a lifetime psychic because he told us that he was making paintings as a young person of his views of the galaxy and the solar system. So he was a childhood psychic, aware of his abilities. Pat Price, to the best of my ability, learned to be psychic through his association with the Scientology Association. L. Ron Hubbard, in addition to starting Scientology, was a scholar of Eastern philosophy, and psychic abilities were well understood for hundreds of years in Buddha's teaching. Let's see what's on you can see on my wall, there's a picture of somebody, of a Buddhist, and that Buddhist is named Padmasambhava, and he is the one who brought Buddhism to Tibet. There was a lot of internecine fighting in Tibet over religion, and the king of Tibet knew a famous Buddhist teacher, Padmasambhava, and invited him to come to Tibet to teach people about Buddhism, and he did that. And he then wrote this book, early book, in the 800s, Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. So Padmasambhava was writing 1,200 years ago about how to quiet your mind and take part in naked awareness, which became called timeless awareness. He was aware that you could move your thoughts through space and through time and describe what was there. And if you would give up your desire to name things and grasp onto them, then you could do it much more successfully. Naming and grasping is the enemy of psychic ability. So we try and get people to describe, what are you experiencing rather than what do you think it is. So this was all understood 1,200 years ago. So the psychic ability is not New Age, but rather was part of Buddhist practice 1,200 years ago.
When you talked about your early childhood and deliberately trying to trick people and pretend to read minds, you say you would get real pieces of information would slip through, for example, where that person lived, what their house looked like. How did those guesses differ from those real pieces of information? Was it a feeling? Was it a vibration? What was it like?
In my experience, is visual. So when I'd be standing on the stage, or in recent cases where Hal Puthoff had gone on vacation somewhere, I'll tell you about that. The short answer to your question is that most people experience, we call it remote viewing because it's a visual experience. We say, don't name the place, just tell us what you're experiencing. What's the surprising image? So what happened once with Pat Price, we'd been doing a series of experiments with Price where my colleague Hal Puthoff had gone on vacation. They break in our experiments. He went to South America, someplace. No one knew where he was going. So each day, I would sit in our little shielded room. Everyone liked being in an electrically shielded room because the shielding prevents electrostatic interference with ESP, apparently. So we would be sitting in our little shielded phone booth, and each day Pat Price would describe to me that Hal is going to a harbor or a church or a market or some other thing in South America. And on day 5, Pat Price didn't show up. And this was an important series of experiments because we were demonstrating, or planned to demonstrate, that distance doesn't interfere with remote viewing, which we suspected was the case. So on day 5, it happened that we knew that Pat Price was going to leave our laboratory because the CIA was nervous about Price working with a bunch of hippies in California. And since they knew that Pat Price could see anything in their laboratory, including what was on their desk, the idea of having a high-quality psychic outside of their control made the CIA very nervous. So they were sort of grabbed or hired Pat Price to leave California and come to the East Coast and take part in ongoing requirements of the CIA. And on the day of our 5th trial, Price was gone. The CIA had made him an offer that he couldn't refuse, so he left SRI, and I was left by myself. And I didn't know what was going on, so I'd already put on the tape recorder this remote viewing with Russ Targ and Pat Price were describing where Hal Puthoff is hiding someplace in South America, but Price isn't here, so I will describe this the best of my ability. And I said, it looks like a airport on an island. And as we're sitting here right now, I'm looking at the picture that I drew, picture of an island airport where I can see the airport going from the left to the right. And there's ocean at the end of the runway. There's an airport building on the left, sand and gravel on the right. And I drew a picture of that. And that was the 5th trial. And eventually I got feedback, and the feedback picture that I got very greatly resembles what I drew. Because I was sitting in my little office, and I know for a fact that nobody gave me the answer. This is my very first remote viewing, and I drew this interesting picture. That's again a picture that's in my book, Third Eye Spies, where I drew this diagonal airport ending with ocean at the end of the runway, grass and gravel on the right, and the airport building on the left. And that turned out to be one of the most accurate remote viewings from our series. The agreement was that the researchers like Hal Puthoff and I were not supposed to take part in experiments, because if you do have a program where the people who are producing the ESP are also the researchers, it looks bad for the credibility of the program. You want the researchers to stand off to the side and watch what's going on. And that's what we had done throughout the balance of the program. Neither Helen nor I had taken part in any experiments. But this was an emergency situation. The psychic was gone. Hal was in South America, and somebody had to do it. And I was a person in the booth. So it turned out that this was my very first trial, and it was among the most accurate drawings that we ever had. So that continued to convince us that psychic ability is probably not very hard to do, because even a scientist can do it. So, and that picture eventually became published widely.
Russell, let me ask you, why do you think you were so successful? It seems very easy for you and very humble to say that anyone can do this, but do you think there was anything else to the fact that on your very first go doing this, off the cuff, unprepared, you managed to get such an accurate representation of what you were trying to find?
Well, that's a two-part question. We know that almost anybody can do it, because my job for my first 10 years was to teach people how to do remote viewing. As we would have people from the government who wanted to see something psychic. What do you got? We've been paying you guys hundreds of thousands of dollars, and people turning out these great pictures. We want to see what that looks like. Could you have Pat Price or somebody do a remote viewing for us? And my answer usually is no, because if we do, one of the attributes that I brought to this job is my background in magic. And I wanted to avoid doing something that looks like a magic trick. So if I have the government scientist go hide someplace, and Ingo Swann describes where he is, the government scientist would worry, how did they tell Ingo where I was? But if I sit with a guy and say, your major is going to hide somewhere with Hal Puthoff, they will be handed traveling instructions from our safe. I have no idea where they're going. Hal doesn't know where they're going to go. No one knows where they are. And it's just you and me in the vault here. And it's 10 o'clock now. I want you to quiet your mind and describe what you're experiencing with regard to the place that the major is hiding. And the fact that I could jolly people along who had no knowledge of ESP, didn't believe in psychic abilities, and the deal was that he's an army man. His job is to investigate psychic ability, so he's sort of on the spot. He doesn't believe in this stuff, but the guy he's paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, which would be me. I'm telling him, I'm sitting with the major, and his job is to describe what it looks like where his partner's hiding, and I'm telling him how to do it. He will do it. So I set the stage where he could either fight with me over how impossible this is, or he could just close his eyes and describe the pictures that appear. And in general, people will agree to close their eyes and describe the picture that appears. And we've had very good success with that. I've had all kinds of skeptical government officers right up, including the Undersecretary of Defense, Walter LaBerge. I'm basically a researcher, and we began to get overwhelmed with requests from the Army and the CIA to do tasks for try and find kidnapped soldiers, downed airplanes, missing submarines. So we became overwhelmed with tasks to do for the CIA, DIA, Air Force. And what I wanted to do instead is create a psychic Army Corps, which became called Stargate. So I said, can you put together a bunch of people who are willing to learn remote viewing, and they will become the basis of a new program out of the Army intelligence arena. And that happened. They allowed me to do that. We had to choose 6 people from a big group of men and women who agreed to learn remote viewing. And that was a program that Walter LaBerge proposed to me if I could show him something psychic. So even the Undersecretary of Defense, in the stress condition, working with me, and his job as a soldier, as the Undersecretary of Defense, his job was to describe where the major was hiding, and he did that excellently. And that was really my job for a decade, to sit with various skeptics, generally skeptics with money. So my job, in a certain sense, was to show the people with money that we were really doing remote viewing, that there was no trick involved, that even a Army officer or a cabinet official in the government could learn to do remote viewing excellently. There was a natural ability, and these guys, I'm sort of answering one of your earlier questions, these guys didn't have any practice. Walter LaBerge flew in with his helicopter, landed in our parking lot, came up to my laboratory and said, I want to see something psychic. And I said, okay, I'm going to show you how to do it. And he said, I don't believe in this. I can't do it. I said, well, you're here to see something psychic. I've taught hundreds of people how to do this. My feeling is that you're probably as good as any enlisted man that you sent to me, and I'll show you how to do it. And he then described where his major was hiding. And that was really my job from 1972 to 1982 when I left.
What are some of the misconceptions around remote viewing, what it isn't? So, for example, people who may be skeptical of it or unsure as to what exactly it is. I got a few questions, Russell. Why aren't all remote viewers rich? Because they could remote view the lottery numbers, for example. So, some of those myths that come around remote viewing.
Well, the best evidence I have 2 strong pieces of evidence for remote viewing. One is the CIA is not easily amused, as you may realize, and they supported our work for a decade. we got a couple of $1 million a year from the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency for finding downed airplanes, finding kidnapped officers, and our job to earn our keep was to find these. We found a downed Russian airplane. Jimmy Carter described this we made a film called Third Eye Spies, and that film opens with Jimmy Carter saying the most amazing thing that occurred during my presidency was we were looking for a downed Russian airplane with reconnaissance code books on board, and we couldn't find it because it crashed in the jungle. But a psychic in California was able to quiet our mind and give us coordinates showing where the plane crashed, and we were able to send in a helicopter and find the downed Russian airplane. So that was sort of what our life was like. We were trying to understand the accuracy and reliability of psychic functioning, and also pacify our customers like the President of the United States and people from CIA. There was never an instance where somebody thought that we were deceived. See, my background in magic was very helpful because I was very scrupulous in making sure that nobody fooled us, no magician showed up to trick us. As we were doing these experiments, they're physics experiments, they're under very tight control. So we worked for a decade, actually 2 decades. I was there for a decade, and there was never any instance where anyone even suspected that there was any trickery involved. So our good reputation was part of the reason you can believe that this is all true. The other is, after I left SRI, I started a similar small group called Delphi Associates, where we were using psychic ability to forecast changes in the silver commodity market. And I won't describe how that was done, but we made 9 forecasts where the silver would go up a little, up a lot, down a little, or down a lot. And all 9 of our forecasts were correct. And we made $250,000. And we published that, and it was written up in the Wall Street Journal. And as you realize, there's no way to do a trick to learn which way the stock market is going. And now there's a whole little industry of people in International Remote Viewing Association. People are interested in applying psychic abilities to forecast the market. So we have not had any problem with people not believing what we were doing, because we were doing operational things for the government and looking into the stock market, all with great success.
Can you talk about one of the big successes was the Patty Hearst kidnapping case? Can you tell us about that?
February of 1994, Patty Hearst was kidnapped. Patty, the daughter of the owner of the San Francisco Examiner, a famous Hearst wealthy, she was a wealthy heiress at City College see, I'm from New York, so it would be called City College. It was the Berkeley part of the University of California, where she was a student in the Simonese Liberation Army. Handful of rebels kidnapped her, and nobody knew where they were, of course. It was great embarrassment that the heiress was kidnapped. So eventually the district attorney in Berkeley, where she lived, called Stanford Research Institute and said, would we help? And Pat Price said, oh yeah, I was a police commissioner in Burbank. I know how to do that. And my partner Hal Putoff and I and Pat Price went to the police department in Berkeley. And Price said, well, let me see your mug book, which is a big loose leaf binder that every police station has. And the mug book is a picture listing of all the so-called usual suspects. That is all the people they've arrested in recent times. And Price said, well, let me look through your mug book and I'll find the guy. And we all stood around this big oak table, Hal and me and Pat Price and a bunch of police detectives. And Price turned page after page as we watched him. And then he got to a page and said, that's the man, Donald DeVries. And Price put his finger on the guy. And he said, Donald DeVries is the ringleader. And he said, I suppose you want to know where he is. Is that right? And everybody laughed and said, yeah, can you tell me where he is? He said, yeah. He went, as they say in the movie, he went that way and pointed north. He said he's driven down Bayshore Freeway, and he got a white station wagon parked by some gas purification tanks across from a diner. And one of the policemen said, well, I know where that is. It's on the way to my house in Northern California, in Marin. So they sent a police car out, and 20 minutes later, they found the kidnapped car, and they knew it was the right car because there were still shells on the floor of the car from where the kidnappers were firing into the neighborhood as they kidnapped Patricia Hearst. So we know that the car that Pat Price sent us to was the kidnapped car they were looking for. And in due course, after they found the car, they also, Donald DeVries surfaced with ads in the newspaper and said, we're not just a bunch of criminals. We want help to feed the poor in Berkeley. A lot of poor people in Berkeley and Oakland, California. And the Hearst family is super millionaires. We're not looking for cash. We're looking for money to feed the poor. And Donald Reed surfaced as the voice of the Sudanese Liberation Army. So we knew at that time that Pat Price had walked into the police station, turned the pages of the book, and put his finger on the ringleader. So that was one of the outstanding. And of course, we didn't catch Donald DeVries because the police killed him in a shootout in Los Angeles. And Patty Hearst ran away to a farm in upstate New York, and eventually was captured when she returned to San Francisco. So that did not have a good outcome. But we did find the ringleader, and we correctly identified where they were.
So there's some very successful practical applications to remote viewing, and you and your group have demonstrated these to the CIA, to the police in a big way. Are there any dangers of remote viewing, whether that be it's in the wrong hands, i.e. Russian, Chinese, authorities, or any dangers to the remote viewer, even themselves? Apologies.
Well, remote viewing is not remote viewing as we were doing at SRI was not a secret thing. We were publishing our remote viewing in the San Francisco Bay Area, and even some of the long distance things where Hal would go to South America. So we published things that we had done, but along the same time, we were doing operational things for the CIA and the DIA. So we never encountered any danger. I went to eventually 1983, 1984. I went to Russia. We had already published our findings, so I was invited to come to Russia and be part of a meeting with Soviet Academy of Sciences, and that led to a very interesting case. I gave a lecture to the Soviet Academy of Sciences about remote viewing. They knew about remote viewing because we had published it, and I met with a Russian researcher, Ruben Agazimsan, in Soviet Armenia, and he was doing remote viewing, and we went to Armenia, and he was doing experiments very much like what we were doing, and found that frequently the remote viewer in his laboratory would describe where the person was going to be even before it was chosen. So this, what discovered is that you would often or occasionally get precognitive noise where the viewer would have information about the hiding place of the distant person even before it was chosen. But when I lectured in Russia, they're very interested in this, and they're big. I ended my talk as said, and what we know from this is that it's no longer possible to hide anything. There are no secrets anymore. And that led to a great rattling of teacups, because I'm in the Kremlin here, big, beautiful room full of red tapestry and gold hangings. And an American researcher is trying to explain to the heart of the Kremlin that I don't know what you guys are doing, but I want to tell you there are no secrets anymore. And they said, well, is there anything you would like to see as long as you're here? And I wondered what they had in mind. And what they didn't know is a few weeks before I had been invited to Russia, CIA, I was getting ready to leave the program, and the CIA asked me if I could have one of our viewers, Hella Hammett, could I have her describe what Brezhnev's office looks like in the Kremlin? And we had a promise that we had never been to the Kremlin. We don't know, had no idea what it looks like. So Hella came in my office, and I said, well, today we're going to the Kremlin, Hella. CIA wants to know what Brezhnev's office looks like. I want you to just lie down on a comfy couch, and we'll go together. We'll go to Russia and see what we can find. And she said, okay, I said, well, just close your eyes and do the best you can. Take us to the Kremlin. She said, well, I'm walking down a corridor hung with red silk brocade. At the end of this corridor, long corridor, there's a door covered with red leather held in place by bright upholstery tacks, brass upholstery tacks. And I said, well, is that Brezhnev's office? She said, I don't know, but this is where I wound up. I said, well, can you open the door? Well, what she said, the door is closed. I said, well, I'll open it for you. And she said, well, it's still dark inside. I said, well, turn on the lights. This is as though I'm leading her in a dream. So she tells me what she can do, and I can help her along the way. So I said, okay, I've turned on, it's called a lucid dream. So I said, okay, I'll turn on the lights. What do you see now? She said, well, out the window on the left, I can see Red Square. I can see the famous cathedral with all the paintings on the outside. And there's a big desk in the room, very large wooden desk with covered with glass. And behind the desk, there's a door in the wall. So I said, well, let's open that door and see where it goes. She said, well, it goes down a flight of metal stairs, and on the right there's a computer room. There's a lot of people working in that computer room. And I said, you know, Helen, I'm beginning to feel a little frightened. I have a lot of top secret clearances, but I have no clearance to be in a computer room in the Kremlin. I feel that they know we're here. I feel that we're being surveilled. So I think we gave them enough information. Let's get out of here. And it turned out that the information that I gave them was largely correct. And I know that they're largely correct because 2 years later, when I was invited to the Kremlin to lecture, I wanted them to let me see Brezhnev's office. I said, I know Brezhnev is not there anymore. He had I think he just retired. So I don't need to see the prime minister, but I want to see his office. And indeed, you walk down this hall with red brocade hanging from the ceiling, and the door at the end of the hall where I stood after our experiment, and the door was indeed covered with red leather, bright gold upholstery tacks, and they could open the door, let me walk in, and indeed, Red Square without the window on the left, you could see the famous church, and on the right, you could see his big desk covered with big wooden desk covered with glass. Unfortunately, I can't remember or did not notice if there was a door in that wall. Somebody would have to hypnotize me. I was in the room, my eyes were open, so presumably if there was a door in the wall, I could remember it. But I was so overcome with the other things that I saw, like the door covered with red leather and the big wooden desk, that I don't get an A+ for being a spy. But all the things that I could remember when I came back from Brezhnev's office perfectly matched what Hella had to say weeks earlier at SRI 6,000 miles away.
Let me just take you back to, you mentioned Pat Price leaving and going to the CIA. Am I right that it was only 4 months after Pat Price left SRI to go to the CIA that he was found dead?
That's right. I visited him shortly before he died. Actually, I visited him. He was his cover job, his pretend job, was being a farmer in a field in West Virginia. And Hal and I visited him in his farmhouse, and there he was with his bib top overalls, raking up the straw and that was his job in the evening. During the day, he would drive a few miles away to CIA and do real-time remote viewing, working with Ken Kress, who is our undercover physics researcher from the CIA. As we had two people monitoring us, Ken Kress, who is the physicist working with the two of us as physicists, and Kit Green, who is a psychologist who is overseeing the psychological protocol of what we were doing. Ken Kress was undercover the whole time. Kit Green was well known as he would visit various ESP laboratories and conferences. So he was well known as a Kit Green was well known as a CIA operative. And Pat worked with Ken Kress doing day-to-day operational things, where Ken would say, we're looking at a facility on the seashore, and Price would describe what the facility looked like and what was going on there. And they had a number of instances where Pat Price would do something in real time in the offices of the CIA, giving them real-time information about what was going on. And he did that for a few months before his death.
The level of ability of many of these psychics we've talked about. So Pat Price, Joe McMoneagle, we've not mentioned yet, Ingo Swann, they're able to view some very, very top secret things. They can read documents on the desks of, like you say, the nuclear powers. They can see or find locations of nuclear submarines around the globe, of which their locations are among the top.
Joe McMoneagle did that very successfully.
With the pins?
Joe McMoneagle did that very successfully. He was being interviewed by somebody at the Bob Monroe facility, and he was able to describe a submarine under construction with a huge submarine, a big building. And he said that it looked like two submarines glued together. There's a giant submarine which was extra wide and extra long, and he drew a picture of that. And it was really just a few weeks later that sub was finally launched. And there were pictures of it available, and the pictures very accurately correspond to what Price was able to draw. And nobody knew anything about it. He didn't know his target was a submarine. His target was a building a mile from the North Sea. Did not look like a good place to launch a submarine from, but in fact, the Russians had dug a trench for launching this sub into the ocean.
Yeah, that was really interesting when I was watching that in the documentary. You mentioned Third Eye Spies. The reason he thought it was a double sub, it turns out the submarine itself was double hulled.
That's right.
So that was incredibly unique. The size of it was bigger than anything had been seen. And when you can view something that size or that secret, is it likely, for example, that Pat Price didn't die of natural causes, but indeed was killed because of his abilities?
Well, that particular instance was Joe McMoneagle. Pat Price did not describe his sub, but people were certainly in. Joe McMoneagle was an excellent remote viewer. we never did anything like compare who is more psychic, Joe McMoneagle or Pat Price or Ingo Swann. Or, for example, Pat Price worked with us and was the most psychic person that we'd ever seen during the 1974-75 period. And he died, and he left us then. And we were then looking for a new psychic. Ken Kress wanted us to find somebody who had never done this before. And I came up with my friend Hella Hammond, who was a photographer, highly intelligent woman, never did anything like this. But she's a friend of our family and thought it would be very entertaining to come to California and be paid to be a psychic person for the CIA. She said, I've done a lot of interesting things in my life, but I've never done anything like that. So she came up and she would stay with us, with our family. And then we would go off to SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and she would hang out with me and help put off an Ingo Swann and learn how to do remote viewing. And in due course, we did a formal series with her, as we had done with Pat Price. We did nine trials where Hal would hide each day for 9 days, and she would try and describe where he was. And then her descriptions would be matched with the actual place by perceptual psychologist would try and match her nine drawings with the traveling instructions where the people were hiding. And it turned out that Pat Price got 7 out of 9 first place matches. Hella did not do that, but she got very close to 9 out of 9. That is, she had a couple that not correct, but her errors were smaller errors than Pat Price. So if you calculate the overall accuracy of Hella, her work was significant at like 1 in a million, which was 10 times more significant than Pat Price. So the bottom line of the story I'm trying to tell you is it turned out that the control subject who had never done this before was more statistically significant than the guy who had been using ESP all of his life.
In any of these experiments, Russell, was there ever limitations looked at? How far could remote viewing go? And I wonder, was there ever, I know viewing is in the title, but was there ever an attempt to physically influence or impact something on the other side of what was being viewed? For example, move a piece of paper or affect something there physically?
No, we did not do any psychokinetic experiments. We did do a distance experiment with Pat Price, which is published. We were being visited by my contract monitor for the ESP teaching machine. Art Reitz came by to see whether or not people were learning to improve their scores with feedback and reinforcement. This ESP game is available, incidentally, as a Apple application. It's called ESP Trainer. When I began with it, it was a free game, so I had it as a free game for a decade on the Apple Store. After 10 years of giving it away free, I'm now asking for $1 if you're interested. But but the ESP game is available, and people and NASA came by. Our REITs came by from NASA, wanted to see where people they were. He was supporting the program. They wanted to know where people improving their scores, and I could show him the score sheets that people began a chance, and over the course of a couple of weeks, their scores improved. And that's just what he wanted to see, whether their program was successful. And he turned to Ingo, who was with us, and I just want to make sure it was the right. Ingo is with us. Pat had already left. And Reeds turned to Ingo and said, well, we're sending a Pioneer number 2 to Jupiter to look for additional things that we had not seen before. Ingo, if the spacecraft will be at Jupiter in 7 months, can you tell, is there anything that we're going to see or discover that we hadn't known before? What's the most interesting thing that we're going to find that's a surprise? And Ingo said, well, give me a pad of paper. And he put down a cigar. And he said, it looks to me, when you get to Jupiter, you're going to see that there's a very large ring all the way around Jupiter. Large ice ring all the way around the planet Jupiter. And Art Reed said, aren't you thinking of Saturn? Saturn is one of the rings around it. And I remember Ingo turning to him and said, you know, I've been looking at the solar system my entire life. You've got to believe that I know the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. When you get your spacecraft to Saturn, when you get your spacecraft to Jupiter, send me a picture, and I expect it to look like this picture that I just drawn here, picture of a planet with a large ring around it. And indeed, in my published work, I do have a copy of Ingo's drawing of the ring around Jupiter from NASA, just as he drew at that time. So he was able to close his eyes and look at Jupiter, which is 400 million miles away, and describe the surface of Jupiter as it was at that time.
You mentioned you've left the program by this point, and then Hal Puthoff left the program just a few years after that. It was carried on by Edwin May from 1985 to 1995. Is that right?
That's right. I left Hal and I started the program in 1972. I left in 82, and Hal left, I would say, in 85. And then Ed May ran the program from 1985 to 1995, when it was eventually shut down.
What were the key differences from when yourself and Hal had left to how it was carried on by Ed May?
Well, Ed is a very skillful guy. He understood what we were doing. I left because I got tired of doing all work that was classified, and I was not able to publish what I was doing. A lot of the work that Ed May did was classified, and that didn't bother him. And eventually, a lot of his work was also published. He did his work. He worked with. Well, Pat Price had died. He worked with Joe McMoneagle and Ingo Swann, and did a highly successful work.
The program seems to be something so incredibly powerful, with so much limitless potential for national security or intelligence reasons. For it to end seems incredibly strange. Do you feel the program carried on in some way, shape, or form?
Well, in our film, I asked Kit Green, whether he felt that it was carried on. And he said, well, the best of his knowledge, that, I trained 2 CIA people during the course of our program. They sent us 2 people, and they wanted to know whether there was anything the matter with our protocol, whether there was cheating or anything. So my job was to train 2 CIA people, see if they could do what our other visitors were doing. And of course, the 2 CIA people they sent us were particularly talented, and they really did well. So afterwards, those 2 people went back to the CIA, and there was a period where the 2 people I trained were working at the CIA with Pat Price. So they had a little CIA book club with a handful of people doing remote viewing. And what Kit Green told us in our interview is that they had programs like that going on. Now, I saw my film was made 10 years after I left SRI, and Kit Green had a lot of information about what was going on at at CIA, and he said indeed there was sort of a small effort continuing to do remote viewing there.
Just before we get on to some listener questions, Russell, you went to the TED Talks platform and gave a talk which is incredibly popular on YouTube with millions of views, but it was actually cancelled by TED Talks themselves for being too controversial. Were you surprised that happened? And how do we shift that perception of this being a controversial topic?
Well, I gave a talk for the TED organization. Suzanne Taylor was the host of a TEDx talk in Los Angeles, and I was one of the speakers. And I gave a talk about remote viewing, and the TED people said that it was too controversial. So the talk that I gave was canceled, and it's had an interesting life. It's canceled and reappeared, canceled and reappeared. I believe that if you look right now for Targ's canceled TED Talk, you'll find a number of reappearances of that talk.
Yeah, there's a lot of versions of it online. And how do you think we shift that perception, Russell, that this wouldn't be a controversial topic to discuss?
Well, it is controversial. That is, there's scientists, basically people who don't know anything about what we were doing regarding psychic ability think that it's very controversial. People who have visited our laboratory or read our papers find that it's not controversial, but rather surprising as to how successful we were working, how successful it was. I don't know what Ted's particular problem was. I think they want to be on the edge of what's believable, and we were too far over the edge for them. That they had no specific complaint. They just said it's too controversial, and they didn't want to be involved in any controversy.
And Russell, what was the last thing you yourself remote viewed? Is it still something you practice?
Oh, I still do remote viewing with some. Let's see. I still do remote viewing with some friends. I have a friend who's a very successful remote viewer, and she has a website, and I occasionally do interviewers with her. I'm not doing anything formal anymore. I occasionally will show people how remote viewing works, which is, of course, quite easy. But I'm not doing anything formal to speak. If somebody asks me, "Will I look at something?" I can do that. My friend Gail Hyson, Hayssen, has a website where there are a number of interviews that she has, including a couple of interviews with me. And Gail is also a very psychic, excellent remote viewer.
I'm going to move on, Russell. We'll finish with some listener questions if you've still got some time to do those.
Yes.
Russell, now when we were arranging this interview, many listeners got in touch about remote viewers RVing or communicating with non-human intelligence. Now, you were very much quick to tell me you're not a UFO person. You're on to talk about UFOs. But Ingo Swann wrote a book called Penetration, and he talked about remote viewing the moon and seeing signs of intelligence and structures. Can you talk about that side of remote viewing?
Well, I've read his book, and in that book, Ingo describes his experience working with the CIA, going to a site in Alaska where he sees a large UFO coming out of the water, and they all have to run away from it. And that's what he describes. I never pursued that with him. I consider Ingo basically to be a truthful person. However, he also writes science fiction. So if you're asking me as a scientist, what do I think? Well, I have no way of knowing. I mean, Ingo describes this very forthright description of seeing a UFO come out of the water, where there's a great literature of UFOs coming out of the water. It's a very, very common event. My friend Richard Dolan is writing a 2-volume book about UFOs coming out of the water. So it's a well-known, well-documented phenomenon of UFOs coming out of the water. I totally believe Richard Dolan's analysis of 600 cases. Because Dolan is a scrupulous remote viewing, scrupulous UFO reporter. But I don't know I simply don't know what the provenance of Ingo's penetrations is.
I wonder, obviously, the many years you spent with your good friend and co-founder Hal Puthoff. Hal famously has a massive interest in the UFO or UAP community. Did you ever speak to Hal about UFOs, or was it purely on ESP, remote viewing, and psychic abilities?
Well, his passion for UFOs really came after he left SRI and became interested in how you would create special material that would allow a spacecraft to go faster than the speed of light. He is very interested in the speed of light propagation, and that pretty much came after SRI. That is, Hal and I did not talk about, to the best of my memory, Hal and I did not talk about UFOs at all.
That's understandable. I think you had a lot of other things to discuss. Listener question.
In the sense that both of us are physicists that we believe in data. That is, if somebody came to us and told us a UFO landed in their lawn, we would both be quite curious to get more data. Do you have any pictures? What does it look like? So forth. But if all they have is their story, that would not be so interesting.
I can appreciate that from a scientific point of view. A lot of people got in touch with me, Russell, to ask you questions. I'm going to read some of those out now. A question from Goodbye Blue. What are the historical origins of remote viewing? And does Russell think certain mystics, or for example, the Oracle of Delphi, may have been exercising this ability?
Yes, the Oracle of Delphi is an example, is a early example that was published probably a couple hundred years before Christ, because it's in the early literature. And this was a case where well, I'm not going to be able to remember, where a wealthy potentate wanted to find the best psychic, and one of those people went to the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi said, "I see this man is in the courtyard. He's got a big brass pot, and he's put a lamb in it and a tortoise, and he's cooking his lamb and the tortoise in his courtyard, and the top of the big pot of the huge brass cover," and so forth. And in fact, in due course, they got a letter from the person in the courtyard, and he described who is the famous historical person where everything he touched turned to gold.
King Midas.
King Midas was the person who ran this experiment. You can tell I'm 90 years old, so my memory is not as good as it once was. Anyway, King Midas is the one who ran this, and when his messenger came back to him, he verified that exactly what the oracle said is what had happened. That he had this was making stew out of whatever it was in his courtyard, and that was verified, by Herodotus in the writings of Herodotus of that time. Herodotus is a trustworthy Greek historian. So Herodotus said indeed, to the best of his knowledge, that experiment was actually done successfully with the Oracle of Delphi. The earliest remote viewings were done by Patanjali in Greece about 200, 300 years before Christ. In the Sutras of Patanjali, he talks about if you can quiet your mind, you're able to look into the distance, look into the future, heal the sick, and diagnose illness. So Sutras of Patanjali is still in print and available, and Patanjali understood quite well how to do remote viewing. So he was that. That's really, I think that there are older references, historical references, but Patanjali is the most acute, detailed reference about what to do if you want to experience remote viewing. This is how to do it. And that was about 400 BC. And what you would look for is the sutras of Patanjali.
I have another question for you from Nine Fingers. He asks, when it comes to remote viewing or other related abilities, is Russell aware of any positive or negative effects of substances such as nicotine, alcohol, THC, or caffeine on these abilities?
I don't know of anything. There are a lot of things that make you feel more psychic, but in general, I don't know of any. There are lots of hallucinogenic drugs you can take that make you feel more psychic. There is a South American drug which is known as telepathine, which is associated with the two-part drug that people use to make contact with animals. What is the famous South American drug? Ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca, yeah.
One of the components of ayahuasca is said to give people remote viewing kinds of experience. But I have no experience with it. I have some experience with MDMA, in which I had early trial with MDMA, and I was able to successfully call out the name and the suit of some playing cards exactly correct with MDMA. And that's the only time I've ever been able to read things directly. So this was during people become attuned to MDMA. Attuned is not the right word, or resistant. Anyway, your strongest experience with MDMA is usually your very first trial. And on my very first trial with MDMA, I wasted that opportunity to have a transcendent experience, to have a little effort at card guessing, which is notoriously hard to do. And I did 3 trials, and all 3 of those were exactly correct. So I don't have extensive experience, but I know that I had that experience. The MDMA is not famous for giving people psychic experiences. MDMA gives people oceanic experience, connected with lots of people, connected with the universe. I don't know of any people who claim that it makes you, to give you psychic experiences, but I definitely had such an experience myself. Generally, the problem is most hallucinogenic things like marijuana or MDMA or DMT interferes with your intellectual functioning, and you need your intellectual functioning in your analysis in order to do remote viewing. Because in remote viewing, you tell a person, quiet your mind and tell me what you're experiencing. And a person needs control or mastery of their intellectual functioning to tell you what you're experiencing. Because you say, don't name it. For example, if the person's hiding next to a fire hydrant, the remote viewer is not going to be able to tell you that he's next to a fire hydrant, nor would you want him to. You want him to be able to describe what he's experiencing. So he needs So a remote viewer needs a working analytic vocabulary to function. So if you're high on some chemical that interferes with your analysis, in general, the quality of a psychic trip wants you to let go of your analytic abilities, and remote viewing requires your analytic abilities. So in general, except for some possible exceptions, in general, any of the well-known hallucinogenics, psychotropic drugs will interfere with your analysis. Everyone would agree that most psychedelics interfere with your analytic abilities because that's their function. Anyway, so that would be my story. My story is that in general, there is no well-known psychedelic that makes you. They all make you feel psychic, but you're disappointed. My biggest disappointment is I had some very powerful marijuana that came into my possession. Had very good reputation, and I tried that. And the thing that marijuana does for you is give you lots of pictures, and having lots of pictures show up in your awareness is the opposite of what you want if you're doing remote viewing. A scientist would say, what I'm describing is a signal to noise problem. That is, high quality marijuana tremendously increases the noise, gives you lots of pictures that have nothing to do with the target. So you want to take something that quiets your mind rather than something that creates pictures.
No, thank you for that answer. I've got a question from Josh. Josh asks, do you think that the theory that time exists all at once explains why remote viewers can see past and future events?
I think people can see the past, the present, the future because we live in a complex space. We live in a complex space-time. That is, there will always be a path from where you are to distant places on the planet or to distant times on the planet. That is, the space-time we live in is a complex quantity. And that is, you're familiar with the idea that there are 3 coordinates, X, Y, and Z, and a time coordinate. But in addition to those 4, each of those 4 could be a complex quantity, have a real part and an imaginary part. Minkowski thought that was true 100 years ago when he was helping Einstein work out a complex part of relativity. So the idea of a complex space-time has some prevalence these days, but nobody's working on it that I'm aware of. If you have a complex space-time, then there will always be a path through that space-time where there is no distance. So you can see into the distance, into the future. If we have a complex space-time, you can see into the distance or see into the future.
Which would make sense. I appreciate that. Final question from Chase. Chase asks, How does one assess whether or not one is predisposed or talented in the way necessary to make remote viewing successful? I know, Russell, you've said this is something almost everyone can do, but are there ways that people may have a natural ability?
I would say you do that by working with another person. Again, in my book, Third Eye Spies, I talk about how you can work with another person, where that person will collect the number of objects in a bag, in 3 bags, say, and bring those to your house. And then say, I put a bag on the floor of the living room. I don't know what we're going to open. Tell me what you experience with regard to what we're going to open. And the reason you want more than one bag is so that you don't simply teach yourself to read the mind of your helper. So I have sort of described it in the opposite direct. If you have a helper and you tell the helper to bring me a bag and put it in the living room, and then you try and describe that, what you will be doing is learning to read the mind of your friend, and you want to be careful not to do that. So you want to set the experiment up. So although your friend has brought you some targets, you don't know, or the friend doesn't know, which one you put on the floor in the middle of the living room. He wants to randomly choose one of his 3 bags, so that what we're trying to do is separate remote viewing from telepathy. In remote viewing, you don't have a person who knows the answer. It's between you and the object. So is that clear what I'm talking
Yes,
about?
I understand that, yeah. Russell, we'll leave it there for all the listener questions. Thank you to everyone who got in touch. And Russell, I want to say a massive thank you to you. You've been incredibly generous with your time. You've mentioned that the latest book, Third Eye Spies, Learn Remote Viewing from the Masters. That is available, folks, on Amazon and all good book publishers. There is the audiobook format as well. I would highly recommend to folks. And the documentary Russell produced of the same name, Third Eye Spies, is available. I watched it myself on YouTube again just a few days ago. Russell, again, thank you for your time with me today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to do that. You have lots of good questions. I'm very happy to chat with you.
That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify. Just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little around.